The kitchen floor was still wet. That was the detail that would haunt investigators for months. Not the silence of the apartment, not the missing woman, not even the two little girls who had stopped asking where their mother was. It was the kitchen floor, scrubbed so aggressively that the grout between the tiles had turned white, and beneath the bleach, beneath the chemical sting that made the first officer on the scene step back and blink. Beneath all of that, Luminol would later find something that no amount of cleaning could erase. Blood. Not a drop, not a smear, a pattern. But that discovery was still months away on a warm July morning in Fuquay-Varina, North Carolina, when a woman named Sandra Day sat in a police station with shaking hands and told an officer that she had not seen her daughter in 4 months, and that she was terrified of what that meant. She wouldn't just leave, Sandra said, her voice barely holding. She wouldn't leave those babies, not Monica, not my girl. The officer across from her was writing something down, and Sandra watched his pen move and thought about how inadequate paper was for a moment like this. How do you write down the particular quality of dread that lives in a mother's chest when she knows, not suspects, not fears, but knows that something has gone terribly wrong? And you said her phone has been active? The officer asked, looking up. Texts, yes, Sandra said, but I haven't heard her voice. I haven't seen her face. The texts don't sound like her. What do you mean they don't sound like her? Sandra pressed her lips together. I mean they sound like someone trying to sound like her. Monica calls her girls her babies, her loves, her sweethearts. In those texts, someone keeps calling them her ladies. She paused. Monica never called them her ladies in her life. The officer looked at her for a long moment. Ms. Day, he said carefully, do you have any idea who might be sending those messages? Sandra didn't hesitate. Brian, she said. Brian Sluss. To understand what happened to Monica Day Moynan, and to understand why it took so long for anyone to realize she was gone, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the dramatic beginning, not the moment everything fell apart, but the ordinary beginning, which is where all the worst stories start. Monica was 22 years old in the spring of 2019, and she was the kind of person who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. See, she had her mother's wide smile and her own particular brand of optimism that her friends described as almost defiant, like she had decided, somewhere along the way, that the world was going to be beautiful, and she was not going to let anyone argue her out of it. She had her hair dyed a deep burgundy that spring, and on her left wrist she wore a tattoo of a small compass that she had gotten the year her oldest daughter was born. When people asked her what it meant, she would look down at it and smile and say, "Means I always know how to find my way home." She had another tattoo on her collarbone, a small bird mid-flight, and a third on her ankle that her mother still teased her about because it was her first and the lines weren't quite straight. Monica was, by every account, stretched thin. She worked the evening shift at Abbey Road Tavern and Grill in Fuquay-Varina, a busy restaurant where she had built up a reputation as someone who was reliable, warm with customers, and willing to pick up extra shifts when a coworker needed a night off. She also ran a small business out of her apartment that she had named Monty's Magic, a side operation selling natural remedies, primarily elderberry syrup for kids. She had started it because she believed in it, because she wanted her daughters to grow up in a house where someone paid attention to what they put in their bodies, and also, honestly, because the tips from the restaurant weren't always enough. On top of the restaurant job and the small business, Monica had recently enrolled in a doula training program. She had sat at her kitchen table one evening, both girls asleep, and told her best friend Deja on the phone that she had figured out what she wanted to do with her life. "I want to be with women when they're most afraid," Monica had said, "that moment when everything hurts and you don't know if you can do it. I want to be the person in the room who tells them they can." Deja had laughed softly on the other end. "That's so you," she had said. "That is so completely, entirely you." Monica had laughed too, and for a moment, in that quiet apartment with her children sleeping in the next room, and a future she had actually planned spread out in front of her, she had felt something close to peace. That was before April. Brian Sluss was 42 years old when he met Monica, though he did not tell her that. He told her he was 35, which was still old enough to give her pause, but not old enough to make her walk away immediately. By the time she found out the truth, a full 20 years separated them, not 15, she was already in love with him, or believed she was, which amounts to the same thing when you are young and someone is paying you the kind of attention that feels like being chosen. Monica's mother had disliked Brian from the first time Monica brought him around. Sandra Day was not a woman who kept her opinions to herself, and she had pulled her daughter aside at the very first family gathering where Brian appeared and said, quietly but clearly, "There is something wrong with that man." "Mama," Monica had said, half laughing, half annoyed. "I'm not joking," Sandra had said. "I'm telling you what I see." "You don't even know him." "I know the type," Sandra had said. And she had left it there because Monica was an adult, and she was her mother, not her warden. And she had learned years ago that telling a young woman she couldn't see someone was the fastest way to make sure she married him. Monica's stepfather, Carl, had tried a different approach. He had taken Brian out for a beer one Saturday afternoon and come home 2 hours later and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long moment before Sandra asked him what had happened. He lied about 3 different things in 2 hours, Carl had said. Small things, things he had no reason to lie about, just lied, like it was breathing. Sandra had nodded slowly. "She'll figure it out," Carl had said, but he hadn't sounded sure. Monica did figure some of it out eventually. She figured out that Brian's relationship with the truth was elastic. She figured out that he was chronically unemployed in a way that didn't seem to embarrass him the way it might embarrass other people. She found out about the theft, a charge from 2 years prior, something Brian had explained away with a story that was convincing enough in the moment, but fell apart if you pulled on any one thread. She found out that Brian had an ex-wife, Jarlyn, which she had known. But she also found out that Brian still called Jarlyn more than ex-spouses typically called each other, and that Jarlyn answered. She stayed anyway, which is the part that's hardest to explain to someone who has never been in a relationship that operates the way Brian and Monica's did. From the outside, it looks like a choice. From the inside, it feels like weather, like something happening to you, not something you're doing. Brian could be cruel on Tuesday and devastatingly tender on Wednesday, and the Wednesday tenderness would make the Tuesday cruelty feel like something she had misread or exaggerated or brought on herself. They had 2 daughters together. Lily came first and then Ava, and those girls were the axis around which Monica's entire world rotated. She was, by every account from every person who knew her, a spectacular mother. Present, engaged, silly when her kids needed silly, and firm when they needed firm. She read to them every night. She made their elderberry syrup herself and kept it in little labeled bottles in the refrigerator, and felt a particular pride every time she watched them take it without complaining. But Brian made things harder. He made things harder in the specific, exhausting way that abusive partners make things harder. By being unpredictable, by undermining her confidence, by making her feel like she was failing at things she was actually doing well. He would show up at the restaurant unannounced and watch her work with an expression she couldn't quite name. He would go through her phone. He would ask, in the particular tone that was not quite a question, where she had been and who she had been with, and why it had taken so long. He made her feel crazy, Deja would later tell investigators. Like she was always one step away from doing something wrong, only she didn't know what it was. That's a terrible way to feel. It wears you down. Monica filed for a domestic violence protective order against Brian in early 2019. She had sat in the courthouse with her hands in her lap and described specific incidents to a court advocate, and then signed her name on the paperwork, and it had felt, for a brief and clarifying moment, like breaking the surface of water after being held under. But Brian did not disappear when the order was issued. He called. He texted. He drove past the apartment. He showed up at places he knew she would be. And Monica, who was stretched thin and tired and raising 2 children and working and building a business and studying to be a doula, did not always have the energy to fight the particular battle of making him go away. The last time anyone outside of her immediate circle saw Monica Moynan was in March of 2019. Her apartment manager, a woman named Greta, remembered seeing her in the parking lot on a Tuesday morning, loading Lily and Ava into the car. Monica had waved. Greta had waved back. That was the last time Greta saw Monica alive, though she would not understand what that meant until months later. Monica's friends started noticing her absence in April. Deja texted her and got responses that were a little off. Not dramatically, not in any way she could point to immediately and say, "This is wrong," but off. Like when a song you know by heart is played in a slightly different key. You can't always name what's wrong. You just feel it. "Hey girl, haven't seen you in a minute. You good?" Deja had texted. "Yes, all good, just really busy with the ladies. You know how it is," came the response. Deja had stared at that text for a long time. The ladies. She scrolled back through months of previous texts from Monica. Her girls were her babies. Her loves, her heart, her little ones. They were never her ladies. She almost called. She told investigators later that she had the phone in her hand and almost called, but she had talked herself out of it. Monica was busy. Monica had a lot going on. Monica would reach out when she had a minute. She had put the phone down and told herself she was being oversensitive. She would not forgive herself for that for a very long time. July came, and by July the silence had become impossible to ignore. Deja had not seen Monica in person since March. Monica's mother had not seen her since March. Her co-workers at Abbey Road Tavern and Grill had been told by the manager, after a call from someone claiming to be Monica, that Monica had quit, effective immediately, for personal reasons. The doula program had received a similar message. It was Deja who finally called Sandra. She did it on a Saturday afternoon, sitting in her car in a parking lot because she had started shaking and didn't want to be standing when she made the call. "Miss Sandra," she said when the older woman picked up, "when did you last actually talk to Monica? Like, hear her voice. There was a silence on the other end of the phone. March, Sandra said quietly. Why? Because I've been getting texts, Deja said, but they don't sound like her. I've been getting texts too, Sandra said, and her voice, when she said it, was the voice of someone who had already begun to understand something terrible, but had not yet allowed themselves to say it out loud. They don't sound like her to me either. 3 days later, on July 23rd, Sandra Day walked into the Fuquay-Varina police department and reported her daughter missing. If you've been watching this and something inside you is already twisting, that tightness in your chest that comes when you know something terrible happened to someone who didn't deserve it, you are not alone. Stay with us, because the story of what happened to Monica Moynan is one of the most chilling domestic violence cases in North Carolina history, and it's not over yet. Drop a comment below right now and tell us, did the texts fool you? Would they have fooled you? We want to know. And subscribe if you haven't already, because you are going to want to be here for every part of what comes next. When police arrived at Monica's apartment on the afternoon of July 23rd, they found Brian Sluss. He was in the apartment. He was driving Monica's car. He was caring for Lily and Ava, who were quiet in the way that children become quiet when they have learned that loudness leads to trouble. An officer noted later that both girls watched their father with a particular, practiced stillness that made the hair on his arms stand up. Brian was calm, almost unnervingly calm. He met the officers at the door with his arms loose at his sides and an expression that the first officer described, in his report, as cooperative but watchful. He invited them in. He answered questions. He said that Monica had left him, that she had developed a drug addiction after starting her restaurant job, that he had tried to help her, had in fact instituted what he called a home rehab plan, keeping her at the apartment, away from the substance, letting her detox in the safety of her own home, rather than subjecting her to the clinical machinery of a treatment center. And you didn't think to involve any medical professionals? The officer asked. Monica didn't want that, Brian said. She was scared of what people would think, of losing the girls. When did you last see her? June 20th, Brian said without hesitation, like he had the date ready. She texted me that morning and said she couldn't do this anymore, and she walked out. June 20th, the officer repeated, writing it down. And you didn't report her missing. I thought she'd come back, Brian said. She always came back. The officer looked at him. Mr. Sluss, her mother says she hasn't seen Monica since March. Something moved across Brian's face. It was brief, and the officer caught it only because he was looking for it. A microsecond of recalibration, of adjustment. Then the careful calm was back. I saw her in June, Brian said. I can't explain what her mother did or didn't see. The investigation that followed was methodical, painstaking, and in some places deeply disturbing. Detectives began by pulling records, phone records, email records, financial records. They interviewed Monica's co-workers, her friends, her doula program coordinator, her neighbors. They spoke to Greta, the apartment manager, who told them about the March parking lot sighting, and also about something else. A phone call she had received in April from a woman who claimed to be Monica, calling to explain that she would be away for a while, that she needed some personal time, so that Brian would be handling things. The voice had been wrong, Greta said. Not dramatically wrong, but wrong. Like someone doing an impression, she told detectives. A decent impression, but an impression. Detectives also found the pregnancy test. It was in the bathroom of Monica's apartment, in the cabinet beneath the sink, tucked behind a half-empty bottle of shampoo. Positive. The date on the packaging suggested it had been purchased in early April. They found the DNA evidence in the kitchen. Luminol applied to the floor tiles, lit up in a pattern consistent with a large volume of blood that had been cleaned, aggressively, thoroughly, with bleach. The grout had been scrubbed so hard that the coloring had faded. Monica's DNA was confirmed from trace material recovered from between the tiles. They found witnesses who had seen Brian in the late-night hours of early April carrying black trash bags from the apartment to his vehicle. Not one trip. Multiple trips. Over multiple nights. They pulled Monica's phone records and mapped the digital activity. Texts and emails sent from Monica's accounts showed a clear pattern. Regular, plausible activity through late March. Then a shift in April. The tone changed, the vocabulary changed, and the location data embedded in the messages showed that they were being sent from locations Monica was not known to frequent. But Brian was. The impersonation was, investigators concluded, methodical and deliberate. Brian had Monica's phone. He had her email passwords. He had been performing her existence for 4 months, so sending just enough communication to keep her family and friends from panicking, making just enough contact to push back the moment when someone would finally ask the question that Sandra Day eventually asked. When detectives sat across from Brian Sluss in a formal interview room in the fall of 2019, they were armed with most of this information, though they could not yet show all of it. Brian was calm in that room the way he had been calm at the apartment door, controlled, careful, with an answer for everything. The texts, one detective said, sliding a printed record across the table. You admit you sent some of these? Brian looked at the printout. Yes, he said. After she left, I used her phone sometimes. To let people know she was okay. You used her phone to pretend to be her. I used her phone to make sure her family didn't worry. Mr. Sluss, the detective said, leaning forward slightly. If she walked out on June 20th, how did you still have her phone? Another microsecond of recalibration. She left it, Brian said. She left in a hurry. She left a lot of things. Including her car. Yes. Including her children. Brian's jaw tightened slightly. She was in a bad place. People do things when they're in a bad place. Monica filed a domestic violence protective order against you in early 2019, the detective said. That doesn't suggest someone who was about to voluntarily leave her children in your care. People change, Brian said. We had worked things out. Had you? We were trying to. The detective looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Sluss, where is Monica? Brian looked back at him. I don't know, he said. I wish I did. The investigation continued. Weeks became months, and through the fall and winter of 2019 and into 2020, detectives built a case without the thing they most needed, Monica's body. She had not been found, not in the woods near Fuquay-Varina, not in any of the locations the trash bags were believed to have traveled, not anywhere. Brian had been thorough. Whatever he had done and wherever he had gone on those late-night trips with the black bags, he had not made the mistake that so many perpetrators made of leaving something behind. It was a nightmare for prosecutors. No body, no cause of death. No physical evidence of a killing beyond the DNA on the kitchen floor and the pattern left by the luminol, which could establish that there had been significant blood loss in that kitchen, but could not, on its own, establish murder. But North Carolina had a law. It was called Britny's Law, named for a domestic violence victim whose killer had evaded justice, in part because her body had never been found. Britny's Law allowed prosecutors, in cases involving confirmed domestic violence history, to pursue murder charges without a body, using the prior abuse record and surrounding evidence to establish what had happened. It was not an easy law to invoke. It required a high evidentiary bar. But in the case of Monica Day Moynan, prosecutors believed they had enough. They had the protective order. They had the DNA. They had the impersonation of Monica's phone and email accounts. They had witnesses to the late-night trash bag runs. They had the pregnancy test. They had the text message analysis showing that the language in Monica's accounts shifted definitively in April, using vocabulary Monica never used but Brian consistently did. And they had something else. Footage from a nanny cam inside the apartment that Monica had installed during the period of the protective order, which she had never removed. The footage, which detectives recovered from the cloud backup Monica had set up, showed Brian interacting with Lily and Ava in ways that made the reviewing detective put down her coffee and stare at the screen in silence for a very long time. On May 12th, 2020, Brian Sluss was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Monica Day Moynan. On the same day, in a coordinated operation, detectives arrested Jarlyn Sluss, Brian's ex-wife, the woman who had been receiving more calls from Brian than ex-spouses typically exchanged. Jarlyn was charged with accessory after the fact to first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. The arrest of Jarlyn Sluss sent a ripple through everyone who had been following the case. Deja, who had been in contact with investigators for months by that point, sat in her living room and stared at the television when the news broke and said, out loud, to no one in particular, she knew. Sandra Day was at her kitchen table when her phone started ringing with calls from people who had seen the news. She let it ring. She sat there with her hands flat on the table and looked at the wall and breathed. Someone had been arrested. 2 people. Brian, yes, but also Jarlyn, which meant there had been someone else who knew, someone who had known what Brian had done and had not called the police, had helped him instead. The call that Greta, the apartment manager, had received in April, the one from the woman with the impression of Monica's voice. Detectives now believed that call had come from Jarlyn. Jarlyn had impersonated Monica over the phone, while Brian impersonated her in texts. They had divided the performance between them. They had collaborated in keeping Monica's disappearance invisible for as long as possible. Jarlyn, when she was booked, maintained her innocence. She told the officer who processed her that she had not known what Brian had done when she agreed to help him. She had suspected something was wrong, yes. She had been afraid of what she might find out if she asked too many questions, but she had not known. The prosecutors did not believe her. Neither, ultimately, did anyone who examined the evidence carefully. Jarlyn had not stumbled into a cover-up by accident. She had made choices, one after another, that had kept Monica's family in the dark, while Monica's daughters grew up in the care of the man who had killed their mother. We need to take a moment here, right in the middle of this story, because what we are about to get into, the trial, the testimony, the battle in that Raleigh courtroom, is where this case becomes something else entirely. Something that matters beyond Monica as much as Monica matters. If you are watching this and you feel that rage, that grief, that specific helpless fury that comes when you realize how long someone was allowed to do harm, we see you. Leave that in the comments. Tell us what you're feeling. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because the second half of this story is where everything comes out, and you do not want to miss it. The trial of Brian Sluss opened in April 2022 in Raleigh, North Carolina, and from the first morning the courtroom was full. Monica's family was there, Sandra Day in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in the particular way of someone who has had years to prepare for a moment and has discovered, now that it has arrived, that no amount of preparation is ever quite enough. Carl sat beside her. Deja sat 2 seats down, and she had brought photographs of Monica. Printed, physical photographs, which she held in her lap throughout the proceedings like a talisman. Brian Sluss was brought in wearing a suit that looked like someone had chosen it carefully, and he sat at the defense table and arranged himself with that same watchful calm that had characterized every interaction with law enforcement. He did not look at Monica's family. This was noticed. It was the kind of detail that jurors file away without knowing they're doing it. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by a woman named Assistant District Attorney Claire Holt, who had been building this case for 2 years and who stood before the jury with a quiet intensity that filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "the defense is going to tell you that Monica Moynan left her children and disappeared because she was struggling with addiction, and she panicked when she found out she was pregnant. They are going to try to paint Monica as a woman who abandoned her family, and I am going to ask you throughout this trial to hold one question in your mind. Does that story make any sense?" She let the silence sit for a moment. Monica Moynan was a devoted mother. She ran a small business built around keeping her children healthy. She was training to be a doula so she could help other mothers through the most terrifying moment of their lives. She had a domestic violence protective order against Brian Sluss, not because she trusted him, but because she was afraid of him. She was rebuilding her life piece by piece, with her daughters at the center of everything she did. Another pause. And then, in April of 2019, she vanished. Not gradually, not with a goodbye, not with a phone call to her mother or a text to her best friend or a conversation with her children. She vanished without a trace, except for the traces she left behind in her own kitchen, in the blood that soaked into those tile grooves so deeply that bleach could not erase it. Ada Holt turned slightly toward Brian. "Monica Moynan did not leave her children," she said. "Monica Moynan was murdered, and the man who murdered her is sitting in this courtroom." The defense opened with the addiction narrative. Brian's attorney, a man named Douglas Farr, was experienced and methodical, and he understood that his best, perhaps his only, viable strategy was to create a Monica who was not the Monica her family and friends knew. He needed to create a Monica who was struggling, spiraling, capable of walking out on her children in a moment of desperation. "What happened to Monica Moynan is a tragedy," Farr told the jury. "No one disputes that. But tragedies happen in more than one way. Sometimes people are taken from us by violence, and sometimes people are taken from us by their own pain, by addiction, by the desperate and irrational choices that addiction causes people to make. He spoke about the restaurant job. He suggested, with careful vagueness, that Monica's co-workers could have introduced her to substances. He described Brian's home rehab plan as an act of love, however imperfect. He described the June 20th text, "I can't do this anymore," as the final communication of a woman who had reached the end of her rope. "My client used Monica's phone after she left," Farr acknowledged. "He will tell you himself that he did this. He was trying to protect her privacy, to protect her relationship with her family, to buy her time to get herself together before she had to face the people who loved her. It was misguided, it was wrong, but it was not the act of a man who had harmed her." He paused. He looked at the jury. "There is no body," he said simply. "There is no cause of death. There is no physical evidence of a crime. What the prosecution has is a woman who is missing and a man they have decided to blame. Do not let them do that. Hold them to their burden. Demand the evidence." The first witnesses for the prosecution were Monica's friends and family, and they brought the courtroom to life in a way that legal arguments never quite can. Deja took the stand first, and she described Monica with such specificity, not just the big, general qualities, but the small, particular ones. The way Monica laughed, the exact phrase she used when she was annoyed with Brian. The night she had called Deja and talked about wanting to be a doula, that several jurors leaned forward slightly, unconsciously closing the distance between themselves and the story. A D.A. Holt asked Deja about the texts. "Can you describe the difference you noticed in the messages you received from Monica's phone after March 2019? "The first thing was the word ladies," Deja said. "Monica never called her girls her ladies. I never. That's not how she talked about them. They were her babies, her loves, her everything. I got a text that said something like, 'Just really busy with the ladies.' And I stopped. I literally stopped and scrolled back through our conversation to see if she'd ever said that before." "Had she?" "No, never." "What else?" Deja thought for a moment. The punctuation was different. Monica was a talker. Even in texts, she used a lot of exclamation points, a lot of emojis. She was enthusiastic even over text. The texts I got after March were flat. Not sad, just flat. Like someone who had been told to write as Monica, and was trying to do it but didn't quite get the energy right. "When you received those texts, did you believe Monica was alive?" "I wanted to believe it," Deja said. "But I think part of me knew something was wrong. I just didn't let myself go there." "Why not?" Deja's voice softened. "Because going there meant she might be gone, and I wasn't ready for that." Sandra Day took the stand on the second day, and the courtroom was very quiet. She had prepared, she was composed, and she told Monica's story the way only a mother can tell it, not as a sequence of events, but as a living thing, something with weight and texture, and the particular irreplaceable quality of a person who had existed and then stopped existing. "Tell me about Monica," Ada Holt said, and Sandra told her. She talked about Monica as a little girl, stubborn and sunny, the kind of child who would fall and skin her knees and get up with a look of grim determination rather than tears. She talked about Monica as a teenager, creative and restless, always starting a new project. She talked about Monica as a mother, which was when Sandra's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "When Lily was born," Sandra said, "I was in that hospital room, and Monica, She had been in labor for 17 hours. She was exhausted, and they put that baby on her chest, and she looked down at her and she said, "Hi, I've been waiting for you." Sandra pressed her lips together. She said the same thing when Ava was born. She had been waiting for each of them. That was Monica. She wanted those babies. Ada Holt let the moment breathe before asking the next question. "Mrs. Day, the defense has suggested that Monica may have developed a substance abuse problem in early 2019. In your observations of your daughter during that period, did you see any evidence of that?" "No," Sandra said firmly. "None. Monica was tired. She was stretched thin. She was dealing with Brian, which was its own kind of exhaustion. But addiction? No. She was present. She was sharp. She was building things, her business, her training program. Those aren't the actions of someone who is spiraling." "Did Brian ever mention any concerns about Monica's substance use to you?" "Never. Not once. The first time I heard that story was when police told me what Brian had told them, and I knew immediately that it was a lie." "How did you know?" Sandra looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "Because I know my daughter," she said simply. "And I know what Brian Sluss is." Douglas Farr cross-examined Sandra carefully, trying to introduce doubt without appearing cruel. He asked about Monica and Brian's relationship, about the conflicts, about the protective order. He suggested, as gently as the suggestion could be made, that Monica's life had been more unstable than Sandra was acknowledging. Sandra did not break. She answered each question directly, without embellishment or evasion, and when Farr tried to suggest that perhaps Monica had been hiding things from her family, she looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite pity. "Mr. Farr," she said, "I'm sure your client hid things from people. That was one of the things he did best. My daughter was not her boyfriend. She was not a person who hid things." The judge sustained Farr's objection to the characterization of Brian, but the jury had heard it. The forensic evidence came in over the course of 3 days. Delivered by specialists who translated their findings into language the jurors could follow without losing the precision that made the findings meaningful. The DNA expert explained how Monica's DNA had been recovered from the kitchen floor, from the grout between the tiles specifically, where even aggressive cleaning could not fully penetrate. She explained that the amount of material recovered was consistent with significant blood loss. The Luminol specialist showed the jury photographs of the pattern revealed by the Luminol treatment. The pattern covered approximately 14 square feet of kitchen floor. The specialist explained in calm and measured language what a 14-square-foot blood pattern means in terms of the volume of blood and the likelihood of survival. The jury looked at those photographs. Several of them looked away. The digital forensics expert spent half a day on the stand, walking through the phone and email records with the thoroughness of someone who has spent months staring at them. She showed the jury the timestamp analysis, how the messages sent from Monica's accounts after April were geolocated to positions Brian was known to occupy. She showed the linguistic analysis, how specific words and phrases that appeared in the post-April messages were consistent with Brian's own documented communication patterns and inconsistent with Monica's. She showed them the word ladies. She had pulled every text message Monica had ever sent from that phone, 2 years of data, and searched for the word ladies used in reference to her children. It appeared 0 times in Monica's own messages. It appeared 11 times in the messages sent after April. Is it possible, Ada Holt asked, that Monica simply changed the way she referred to her children in April? Possible, yes, the expert said carefully. But in my experience analyzing digital communications, core vocabulary for referring to loved ones, especially children, is among the most stable linguistic markers a person has. People change a lot of things about how they communicate. They don't typically change what they call their kids. The pregnancy test was introduced into evidence on the 4th day, and the courtroom felt the weight of it. Ada Holt addressed it directly and deliberately. The positive pregnancy test recovered from Monica's apartment, she told the jury, represents not one victim but 2. Monica was pregnant at the time of her death. That child also died. She did not dwell on it beyond what the evidence required. She didn't need to. The jurors understood. Farr tried to use the pregnancy in his counter-narrative, suggesting that the discovery of a pregnancy could have been what caused Monica to flee. The panic of an unplanned pregnancy, on top of already difficult circumstances, the fear of what Brian would say, the impulse to run before having to face any of it. It was a logical argument on paper, but it required the jury to believe that Monica had fled so completely that she had never contacted her mother, never reached out to her best friend, never checked on her daughters, and that Brian, the abusive ex with a history of lies and theft and stalking, had responded to her disappearance by cleaning her kitchen floor with bleach and carrying black trash bags to his car in the middle of the night. Farr knew the argument had limits. He made it anyway because it was what he had. The nanny cam footage was the moment the trial shifted. Monica had installed the camera, a small device, easily overlooked, positioned to cover the living room and part of the hallway, during the period when she had the protective order and was most afraid. She had set it to upload continuously to a cloud account that only she controlled. Brian, who had taken over the apartment after her disappearance, had not known the camera was there. The footage from April and May of 2019 showed Brian in the apartment with Lily and Ava. A DA Holt played specific clips, curated from hours of footage, that showed how he spoke to the girls, how he responded when they cried, what happened when they asked for their mother. She did not play the most extreme clips. The judge had ruled on what was admissible in terms of the children, and Holt respected those limits scrupulously. But what she did play was enough. It was enough to see the environment those children were living in. It was enough to see that Lily, the older one, had learned to make herself very small, very quickly when Brian's voice changed register. It was enough to see 4-year-old Ava asking, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, "Where's Mama?" and hear Brian say, without looking up from his phone, "She's gone. Stop asking." The courtroom was very quiet when that clip played. Monica's mother closed her eyes. Brian Sluss took the stand in his own defense on the 7th day of the trial. This was a calculated risk, and Farr had spent months preparing his client for it. The prosecution would cross-examine. The jury would see Brian up close. Everything he said, every expression he made, every pause and recalibration would be observed and remembered. But Farr had concluded that the case against Brian was strong enough that the only chance was for the jury to hear from Brian directly, to hear him tell his story, look them in the eye, and present himself as a man who had lost the mother of his children and was being blamed for it. Brian was composed on the stand. He told the story of Monica's addiction with the fluency of someone who had told it many times. To police, to himself, all in the quiet hours when a story has to hold together against the pressure of knowing what is true. He described the home rehab plan with a grief that seemed genuine, or was performed with enough skill to seem genuine. He described the morning of June 20th with specific detail, what Monica was wearing, what she had said, the way she had looked at him before she left. She looked scared, Brian said, of herself, not of me. She knew she had a problem. She knew the pregnancy made everything more complicated, and she couldn't face it. After she left, Farr said, you used her phone and email accounts to send messages to her family and friends. Is that correct? Yes. Why? Brian looked at the jury. Because I knew her mother would panic. Sandra loves Monica, but she has a tendency to make things about herself. To escalate. I knew that if Sandra found out Monica had gone, she'd call the police, create a scene, and Monica would feel trapped. I was trying to give her space to come back on her own terms. It was, ADA Holt thought, watching from the prosecution table, a beautifully constructed answer. It used something real, the complicated dynamics between Monica and her mother, and bent it into a shape that served Brian's narrative. If Sandra had never reported Monica missing, it might even have been almost persuasive. But Sandra had reported Monica missing, and what the police had found when they came to that apartment had not been the scene of a woman who had left voluntarily. Ada Holt's cross-examination of Brian Sluss lasted 4 hours. She was methodical. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform outrage. She simply moved through the evidence piece by piece and asked Brian to explain each one. The DNA on the kitchen floor, she said. How do you explain that? Monica was pregnant, Brian said. There can be blood from a pregnancy that isn't a death, spotting, complications. The volume of blood indicated by the luminol pattern, Holt said, is estimated at approximately 1.5 to 2 liters. Can you explain how a pregnancy-related spotting incident would produce 2 liters of blood? Pause. I'm not a medical expert. No, Holt agreed, but the jury heard from one. The medical expert testified that 2 liters of blood loss is not compatible with survival. Do you have any other explanation for how Monica's DNA came to be present in that volume on your kitchen floor? Silence. No. The trash bags, Holt said. Your neighbor, 3 of them independently, reported seeing you carry multiple large black trash bags to your vehicle on multiple nights in early April. What was in those bags? Trash, Brian said. I was cleaning the apartment. At 2 and 3 in the morning. I don't sleep well. You were cleaning the apartment at 2 and 3 in the morning in early April, which is also the period when Monica's digital activity changed. Her DNA was found on the kitchen floor, and she was never seen alive again. Brian looked at her steadily. Yes, that's a lot of coincidences, Mr. Sluss. Farr objected, sustained. Holt moved on, but the jury was watching Brian, and Brian's steadiness, which had served him in the earlier part of his testimony, had begun to look, under the sustained pressure of Holt's questioning, less like composure and more like something else, something practiced, something maintained. She returned to the word ladies. You admit that you sent messages from Monica's phone after her disappearance, Holt said. After her departure, yes. In those messages, Monica's daughters are referred to as her ladies. Is that correct? I don't remember the specific word choices. Holt showed him the printouts. 11 times, she said. 11 messages from Monica's phone referring to her children as the ladies, or my ladies. Digital forensics analyzed 2 years of Monica's own messages from that phone. She never used the word ladies to refer to her children. Not once. She looked at him. But in reviewing your own communications, your texts, your emails, your social media posts, the word ladies appears frequently. See, it's part of your vocabulary, Mr. Sluss, not Monica's. Brian said nothing. Because you wrote those messages, Holt said. Not a question. You wrote them, and you couldn't quite stop yourself from sounding like you. Objection, Farr said. Counsel is withdrawn, Holt said. She turned back to her table. She had said it. It was in the room. The closing arguments were delivered on a Friday morning, and by the time ADA Holt was finished, the courtroom felt as though it had been compressed, as though the air had gotten heavier over the course of the trial and was now pressing down on everyone inside. Brian Sluss is going to ask you to believe, Holt said, that Monica Moynan, a woman who called her daughters her babies, who made them elderberry syrup, who stayed up late at her kitchen table studying to become a doula so she could help other mothers, walked out on those daughters without a goodbye, without a note, without a phone call to her mother or her best friend, without taking her car, her wallet, her identification, or any of the belongings you would take if you intended to leave. She paused. He's going to ask you to believe that she did this because she was addicted to substances. Substances no one who knew her ever observed. Substances her mother never witnessed. Substances her co-workers never reported. Substances for which there is not a single piece of documentation. He's going to ask you to believe that he cleaned the kitchen floor with bleach and carried black bags to his car in the middle of the night because he is simply a man who doesn't sleep well and keeps a clean apartment. She looked at the jury. You are sensible people. You have common sense. You have the evidence. And I believe that when you sit down in that room and you ask yourselves whether Brian Sluss's story makes any sense at all, when you hold his story up against Monica's DNA on that kitchen floor, against those 11 messages signed with a word Monica never used, against those little girls sitting in that apartment, not asking for their mother anymore, because they had learned that asking led nowhere, you will know what happened to Monica Moynan. Her voice, which had been measured throughout, dropped slightly. She deserves your verdict, she said, and her daughters deserve to know that justice, at least, was not denied to their mother. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. When they came back, the forewoman stood and delivered the verdict in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Guilty. First-degree murder. Brian Sluss showed no visible reaction. He sat at the defense table and was still, and the stillness was the most frightening thing about him, that in this moment, he had nothing. No recalibration, no adjustment, just the blankness of a man who had been caught at last and had nowhere left to go. Sandra Day, in the front row, made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing and not quite any sound that has a name, because it was the sound of grief and relief arriving in the same breath, which is one of the more violent emotional experiences a human being can have. Carl put his arm around her. Deja, 2 seats down, pressed Monica's photographs to her chest, and stared at the ceiling. Brian Sluss was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing was its own separate agony. Monica's family members were allowed to give impact statements, and Sandra Day, who had been composed throughout the trial with the determination of someone who would not give Brian the satisfaction of her visible grief, stood at the podium and let herself come apart, quietly, like something that had been held under pressure for too long. Monica was 22 years old, Sandra said. She was going to be a doula. She was going to open a real business. She was going to watch her daughters grow up. She had plans. She had a whole life that was already becoming something beautiful. She stopped for a moment. And you took it. You took her. And then you spent months pretending to be her, using her voice to tell us she was fine. While we waited and hoped, and told ourselves we were being paranoid. Her voice cracked. You don't get to take her and then take the grief too. You don't get to take everything. She looked at Brian. He did not look back. Where is she? Sandra said. Tell me where she is. You've already been convicted. You're already going to spend the rest of your life in a cell. What does it cost you now? What does it cost you to give her back to us? Give us somewhere to go. Give us a place to put flowers. Give her daughters somewhere to sit and talk to their mother. Brian said nothing. He has said nothing since. The Brian Sluss case was resolved separately. Having agreed to testify against Brian at trial, Brian negotiated a plea arrangement that resulted in reduced charges. She was sentenced to supervised probation with community service, a resolution that Monica's family felt keenly. The woman who had impersonated Monica over the phone, who had known what Brian had done and chosen silence and complicity over a phone call that might have led investigators to the truth sooner, who had helped Brian maintain his cover for months, while Monica's daughters grew up motherless. That woman would not go to prison. She made choices, Deja said when asked about the outcome. She made choices that kept Monica hidden. I understand why the prosecution needed her testimony. I understand the legal calculus. But I'm not going to pretend that it feels like justice for what she did. Lily and Ava Sluss, Monica's daughters, were placed in a stable environment following their father's arrest. Monica's family was involved in their care, which was something Sandra had fought for and received, and which mattered more to her than she had words for. She has said in the years since the conviction that she talks to them about Monica. She shows them photographs. She tells them the stories. She makes them the elderberry syrup from the recipe she found in Monica's handwriting in a notebook in the apartment. I want them to know who she was, Sandra has said. Not just that she's gone, but who she was. Because she was extraordinary. She was 22 and she was already extraordinary, and they deserve to know that. This is where we have to leave Monica Moynan's story, not because it's over, but because in the most important sense it isn't. Her body has never been recovered. Brian Sluss, sitting in a North Carolina prison, has never told anyone where she is. Her family still cannot visit a grave. Her daughter still cannot sit somewhere specific and feel close to their mother. But what the trial of Brian Sluss established, permanently and on the public record, is what happened. Not allegedly, not probably. What happened? A young woman who was building something, a business, a career, a life, was killed in her own kitchen by the man who was supposed to be the father of her children. And the law, using the tools that a previous victim's tragedy had made available, held him accountable for it. Britny's Law worked. In Monica's case, it worked. If there is any legacy to be drawn from an event this terrible, let it be that Monica's case became part of the foundation that will make it harder for the next Brian Sluss to kill someone and walk away because the body cannot be found. That Monica's death, which he tried to make invisible, became instead one of the most visible cases in North Carolina domestic violence legal history. That she was seen, finally. That she was found, at least in the ways the law could find her. Asterisk, there is a photograph of Monica Day Moynan that her mother keeps on the mantelpiece. It was taken at a birthday party, Monica's own, her 21st, and she is mid-laugh, her burgundy hair bright under party lights, one of her daughters on her hip, the other tugging at her sleeve. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking at the daughter on her hip with an expression that is so purely joyful, so completely undefended that it almost hurts to look at. Sandra looks at it every day. She knew how to love people, Sandra has said. That was her thing. She was good at loving people. She would have been the best doula, because she had that thing where you can feel that someone is entirely with you. Present. When Monica was with you, she was with you. You felt it. She pauses. Brian couldn't stand that, she says quietly. He couldn't stand being with someone who knew how to be fully present because he could never do it himself. He could only perform it. And she was real, and he couldn't control real. So she stops. She looks at the photograph. She's not gone, Sandra says finally. She's missing. There's a difference. Gone means it's over. Missing means we're still looking. We'll keep looking. We'll never stop. The case of Monica Day Moynan is studied now in discussions of domestic violence law, of digital forensics, of no-body prosecution strategy. It appears in advocacy materials produced by domestic violence organizations. It is referenced in discussions of Britny's Law and the specific conditions under which North Carolina allows prosecutors to pursue murder charges without physical remains. It is a case study. It is a legal precedent. It is a tragedy. It is also a woman who made elderberry syrup for her children, who had a compass tattoo on her wrist, who wanted to be in the room with other mothers at their most afraid so she could tell them they could do it, who said to each of her daughters when they were placed on her chest for the first time, "Hi, I've been waiting for you." She deserved more. She deserved everything she was building. She deserved to watch Lily and Ava grow up, and to open her business, and to graduate her doula program, and to have someone put a tattoo on her skin that she would be embarrassed about for years, and to call her best friend late at night and talk about the future. She was 22 years old. If you've stayed with us through this entire story, thank you. That means you understand why Monica's story matters. Not just as true crime, not just as a case study, but as a reminder of who we lose when domestic violence is allowed to escalate unchecked. Monica was not a statistic. She was a person who was in the process of becoming everything she was meant to be. If you found this story important, if Monica's memory deserves to be kept alive, please subscribe. Please like this video. Please share it. Because every view is another person who knows Monica's name, who knows what Brian Sluss did, who understands why Britny's Law matters. And if you are in a relationship right now that feels the way Monica's relationship with Brian felt, unpredictable, exhausting, frightening, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-7997-233 You can also text START to 88788. You do not have to wait until it gets worse. It doesn't have to get worse. There is help. There is a way out. Monica's daughters are growing up. They will know who their mother was. And part of that story is you, watching this, refusing to let her disappear twice. Rest, Monica. We've got you from here.